I like visiting cemeteries. I do a fair amount of genealogical work, so visiting cemeteries and checking graves and tombstones is part of it. Sometimes you can learn a lot about the history of a place and how people lived by visiting cemeteries. Victoria, British Columbia, at the southern tip of Vancouver Island, is known as the most haunted city in Canada. The city is built upon Indigenous burial grounds that have existed for thousands of years. The Chinese cemetery at Harling Point is a place no one goes at night. There is a long-standing tradition that if you plan on walking within the cemetery, bring along an offering, maybe some fruit, to leave on the altar for any hungry ghosts that may be there waiting for you, especially in August, the ghost month. The gate to this 120-year-old cemetery is called the Gate of Peaceful Repose. But for the people buried here and the Chinese community at large, the history of this place is tainted with racism, prejudice, and injustice up until 1961, when it was finally designated a National Historic Site. The city of Victoria is home to the oldest Chinatown in Canada and the second oldest in North America after San Francisco. Fort Victoria was a Hudson's Bay Company trading post, established in 1843. According to HBC records, by early 1848, the fort was home to 50 European employees and another 200, composed of Hawaiians who had been here since about 1811, and blacks and Chinese who came up from Oregon Territory to escape the new discriminatory laws in America. About 700 Indigenous people, Coast Salish, lived right outside the fort. A series of questionable and illegal treaties were made to move the Indigenous people further away, and by 1858, Victoria had around 500 European settlers. That year, a ship arrived from San Francisco, bringing a wealthy Chinese merchant and a number of employees to set up businesses in the new colony. Victoria's Chinatown was established, populated by young men whose families were still in China. Then the Fraser River Gold Rush started. In July of 1858, 2,800 prospectors arrived from San Francisco to purchase their licenses to mine for gold. The number of arrivals continued to skyrocket, with people coming from England, the US, China, and even Australia. By the end of 1858, 30,000 licenses had been issued. And wherever there are people, there is a need for room and board, groceries, and eventually, cemeteries. Prior to 1858, graves were next to the Hudson's Bay Company settlement. The story of how and why the graves had to be moved is in my video of the old burying ground, now known as Pioneer Square. The old burying ground became rather infamous when many residents had to be disinterred again and reburied elsewhere, like the newly designated Ross Bay Cemetery. Ross Bay Cemetery opened in 1873. It was designed as a public cemetery with sections for the various religious congregations and others for the general public. The city designated Block L for, quote, Aborigines and Mongolians, end quote. But Block L was practically on the beach, at sea level, and so close to the ocean that heavy rainfalls and winter storms eroded the soil and washed away graves, sending coffins out to sea. By 1902, there were nearly 1,200 Chinese graves in Ross Bay Cemetery, crowded into Block L with Japanese and Indigenous graves and spilling over into the adjacent blocks N and K. The white community was not happy with this so-called encroachment. In 1903, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association bought 3.5 acres here at Harling Point, carefully chosen by a Feng Shui master for the protection of the remains of the deceased and their spirits and the well-being of their descendants. The graves of Chinese people are traditionally placed in a north-south direction, with the head in the north, facing south. The Feng Shui elements are described on the first sign in the cemetery. Feng Shui. The sign here reads, Feng Shui is an ancient Chinese system of arranging objects and designing spaces in such a way as to achieve harmony and balance with the environment. The practice of Feng Shui dates back over 3,000 years and is based on the idea that the energy that flows through our surroundings affects our well-being, success, and happiness. Chinese cemeteries are arranged based on Feng Shui. In this location at Harling Point, there is protection on the left from the Azure Dragon, higher ground, and on the right from the White Tiger, lower ground. These two energy currents, the Azure Dragon and the White Tiger, converge at Gonzales Hill behind. Surrounding this area with living water, a symbol of wealth, are McNeil Bay, Juan de Fuca Strait, and Gonzales Bay. The cemetery here is like an officer sitting behind a desk overlooking the grand hall ahead, Juan de Fuca Strait, facing the distant Worshippers Mountain, the Olympic Mountains. Even though they had the city's assurance that the Harling Point land could be used as a cemetery, the Chinese were not convinced that a situation like the one they'd experienced at Lake Hill would not reoccur and force them to move again. In 1891, their first burial on their land at Lake Hill was interrupted and prevented by neighboring landowners. So in the fall of 1903, they held a mock funeral here at Harling Point to see what the surrounding neighbors would do. Sure enough, one of the white neighbors came out with a shotgun and started firing at them. The police were called, the trigger-happy neighbor was arrested, and the city and the Chinese community prevailed. During the years 1903 to 1909, 3/4 of the nearly 1,200 Chinese graves in Ross Bay Cemetery were exhumed and relocated to the new cemetery at Harling Point. The exhumations were done by city workers at a cost to the CCBA of $6 each. One evening in 1909, city workers left some of these coffins out in the open. During the night, they were vandalized and the bones thrown around the cemetery. So the CCBA asked the city to waive the exhumation cost if the CCBA would do the work themselves, removing the deceased and dismantling the altar. City Council agreed. A newspaper account of the meeting reported that several councillors were pleased that their deceased white relatives would no longer have to lay next to Chinese graves. But the hardship and discrimination continued. In the old days, the overseas Chinese people believed that after a person's death, his soul still existed and hovered over his tomb. If he died in a foreign country, his soul would be homeless and therefore unable to rest until his body was shipped back to China and buried in his home village. The incinerator towers and altar. The most common singular feature of overseas Chinese cemeteries is the burner. These brick or masonry structures are often over 7 feet tall and serve as a safe place for the ritualized burning of spiritual tributes. Spiritual tributes can be paper or cardboard facsimiles of money, clothing, possessions, and houses to serve the deceased in the afterlife. Burning these offerings passes them to the spirit realm. This sign reads, "Before 1903, the remains of early Chinese immigrants were buried in the low-lying southwest corner of Ross Bay Cemetery. This area was often flooded after a heavy rainstorm. In the early 1900s, high winds and waves eroded a few waterfront Chinese graves, exposing coffins and sweeping away their remains. In 1903, the Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association purchased this site for a cemetery. In traditional Chinese burial practices, the remains were exhumed after 7 years, the bones cleaned and dried and packed in wooden crates for shipment back to China. While awaiting shipment, these bones were kept in a bone house. Remains from across Canada were sent to Victoria for storage until the next shipment. Transfer of these remains ended in 1937 when China prohibited the practice. The Chinese Consolidated Benevolent Association closed the cemetery in 1950 after all of the available burial sites were occupied. A final ceremony was held in 1961, burying the last of the remains in 13 mass graves. These remains numbered over 900 bone boxes from other parts of Canada that had waited all those years to be placed at rest. Victoria is actually a very small city, surrounded by a dozen larger municipalities that have their own mayors, councils, and bylaws. In 1906, Oak Bay Municipality was formed, and the Chinese cemetery was now within the boundaries of Oak Bay. In 1907, the CCBA built a brick structure in the Chinese cemetery for the storage of the bone boxes and erected a wooden hut nearby for a caretaker to look after them. Like some of the citizens of Victoria before them, Oak Bay Council didn't want the cemetery or a bone house in or anywhere near their municipality. Neighbors protested that their properties would decline in value. Waterfront land is valuable, especially to developers. Oak Bay Council made several efforts to have the land ownership reversed and the cemetery closed and graves removed. The City of Victoria intervened. They had approved the land use as a cemetery, and the cemetery had already existed for several years. So when that idea failed, Council brought health inspectors in, twice, to investigate accusations that the graves were too close to the surface and would spread disease. The accusations were unfounded and had no merit. Then it was taxes, then water, then sewer requirements. Each time, Council was unsuccessful. This went on for decades. Finally, the CCBA, backed by the courts and the Canadian federal government, were vindicated. The designation as a National Historic Site in 1961 meant that there could be no more discrimination here. Natural features. This sign reads, "Harling Point is home to several rare plant species and the location of unique geological features. At this site, during the moist spring flowering season, you can see plants only found in a gentle Mediterranean climate, including the common and tall camas, shooting star, the white fawn lily, and the nearly extinct McCown's meadow foam. 2 pieces of the Earth's crust meet at Harling Point, where 40,000 years ago, 2 continents collided. Glaciers have carved grooves in the rock, leaving behind several large glacial erratics, rocks moved by glaciers and deposited on top of a different kind of rock. One such erratic is here, known as Harpoon Rock. It's associated with local Songhees oral tradition, and they call this rock Sasama. Sasama, meaning harpoon, was the original name identified by Songhees elder James Fraser for the point where the Chinese cemetery is located. A man with a harpoon was hunting seals from that rock. A powerful spirit named Hyles, the transformer, with spirit companions Raven and Mink, came by in his canoe, frightening away the seal the harpooner had been stalking. The harpooner rebuked them for causing him to lose his target, and Hyles turned him to stone as he stood there poised to throw the harpoon, saying, "You'll be the boss for seals, from Souk to Nanaimo." So now the hunter, facing the ocean and the seals he hunted, is watching the seals for eternity. We'll move on now to Gonzales Hill. It overlooks the southern coastline of this area. At the top of the hill is the Gonzales Observatory, a weather station that is no longer in use. The area is now a regional park and has little trails running through it. So this is Gonzales Hill Regional Park, and it is a beautiful first Monday in August, so it's a holiday, beautiful afternoon, and I'm going to explore the park a little bit before going up to the observatory, because I've been up to the observatory many times, but not through the park. Okay. There's a little trail up here. Look at these rocks. You can tell that they were pushed up a long time ago. You can see all the layers. There is a little step down right here. I think I'm gonna kind of go around it. Don't trust the sandals I'm wearing. So I could go up this way or follow the arrow for a little bit and go this way. Okay, the view from the bench. Here's the other trail. There's the arrow. Now this is all shale. I think I might play it safe and just go around the to the other side and come back out this way. Gonzales Hill and the observatory. Gonzales Hill is the apex of the geological triangle protecting the Chinese cemetery and is the highest point on the southern coastline of Vancouver Island. There are higher hills and mountains inland, but if you're looking for views right on the coastline, this is the place. The observatory itself was completed in 1914 and for 75 years was a meteorological station with living quarters on the main floor. The first scientist caretaker was Francis Napier Denison, a meteorologist, astronomer, seismologist, inventor, who co-designed the observatory and designed and installed all sorts of meteorological instruments and equipment. He supplied the observatory with a telescope and gave regular tours. The observatory also housed telegraphic equipment that was used in a very specific way. One of Denison's daily tasks up until his retirement in 1936 was keeping time. Using a transit telescope, Denison tracked stars passing across the meridian and then measured the sun's movements to calculate exact local solar time. Just before 1 p.m. each day, he sent a telegraphic signal to the Balmoral building in downtown Victoria, activating the time ball on top. The time ball was visible from the inner harbor and was a feature in nearly every maritime port. The time ball dropped at 1:00 p.m. every day. Citizens and mariners adjusted their clocks, watches, and chronometers to the correct time. Denison's wife Ethel was a daughter of Captain John Walbran, an explorer, mariner, and historian whose name is well known in BC. There are several places named after him and a cairn dedicated to him in the Gonzales Regional Park. Captain Walbran named an island for her, Ethel Island. It's up in the river's inlet area, about halfway between Port Hardy and Bella Bella. Ethel was a passionate gardener. Her lush gardens surrounded the observatory, and her willingness to share her knowledge and plants with locals made her a beloved community figure. Her garden is long gone, but the site is now a nature preserve. Gonzales Hill is home to a number of protected species of rare and endangered plants, like McCown's meadow foam, yellow montane violet, and deltoid balsam root. The park also has endangered trees like the Gary oak and arbutus, both threatened by habitat loss and climate change. The observatory stopped its operations in 1989, and the building is now a heritage site and a protected regional park, with hiking trails, picnic spots, and amazing viewpoints. This observatory and the park surrounding it are one of the less visited places in Victoria, and that's probably a good thing. Thanks for watching. Please let me know your thoughts in the comments and click that like button. More videos are on their way. Thank you.